The mark that changed everything. Sarah Martinez stood in the checkout line at the grocery store, her military uniform crisp and clean after another long day of training recruits at the naval base. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the distinctive birthmark that covered nearly half of her left cheek. It was shaped like an irregular butterfly wing, dark purple against her olive skin. The woman behind her in line whispered loudly to her friend, making no effort to hide her disgust. "Look at that thing on her face. How can someone walk around like that? If I had something that ugly, I'd never leave the house." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. She had heard comments like this her entire life. The port wine stain birthmark had been with her since birth, a permanent reminder that she was different. Growing up, children had called her names, pointed at her in hallways, and some parents had even pulled their kids away when they saw her coming. "Maybe it's contagious," the woman continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "Should someone like that even be allowed in the military? I mean, what if it affects her performance or scares the other soldiers?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her basket tighter. 28 years old, and the words still cut deep. She had joined the Navy 6 years ago, hoping to prove that her worth wasn't determined by her appearance. She had excelled in every training program, earned multiple commendations, and worked twice as hard as anyone else to show that the mark on her face didn't define her capabilities. The cashier, a teenage girl with bright pink hair, looked uncomfortable as she scanned Sarah's items. Her eyes kept darting between Sarah's face and the women behind her, unsure of what to do. The store seemed unusually quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. "Honestly, with medical technology today, you'd think she could get that fixed," the first woman said, her voice growing louder. "It's almost selfish to walk around looking like that. What about the children who have to see it?" Sarah finally turned around, her dark eyes meeting the woman's shocked gaze. "Ma'am, I'm sorry if my appearance offends you, but this is just how I was born. I've served my country for 6 years, and I've never let this mark stop me from doing my job." The woman, middle-aged with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive jewelry, looked taken aback that Sarah had actually responded. "Well, I'm just saying that there are options nowadays. You could at least try to cover it up with makeup or something. It's quite disturbing for the rest of us." Several other customers had now turned to watch the exchange. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few nodded in agreement with the blonde woman. Sarah felt the familiar heat of shame rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her childhood and adult life. "I don't wear makeup to hide who I am," Sarah replied quietly, her military training helping her maintain composure. "And I don't owe anyone an explanation for my appearance." The woman's friend, a thin brunette with designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, chimed in. "But you have to understand, it's just shocking. People aren't prepared to see something like that. Maybe you could be more considerate of others." The cashier had stopped scanning items altogether, her young face flushed with embarrassment for Sarah. Other customers in nearby lines had turned to stare, creating a circle of unwanted attention around the scene. Sarah had faced this kind of discrimination her whole life, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because she was in uniform, representing something bigger than herself. Maybe it was because she had just spent the day training young sailors who looked up to her despite her birthmark. Or maybe she was just tired of hiding. "I understand that my appearance might be surprising," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "But I'm a human being, just like you. I have feelings, dreams, and aspirations. I've dedicated my life to serving this country, and I've earned my place in the military through hard work and dedication, not because of how I look." The blonde woman rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, don't try to make this about patriotism. I'm just saying that in public, people should try to present themselves in a way that doesn't make others uncomfortable. It's common courtesy." Sarah felt tears threatening to well up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that crying only made people more uncomfortable around her, as if her emotions were as disturbing as her appearance. The teenage cashier finally found her voice. "Ma'am, I think maybe we should just focus on getting everyone checked out," she said nervously, looking between Sarah and the women behind her, but the damage was already done. Sarah could feel the stares of every person in the store, could hear the whispered conversations starting around her. She had thought that at 28, with a successful military career and a strong sense of self, she would be immune to these kinds of attacks. But the pain felt just as sharp as it had when she was 8 years old, and the other children wouldn't include her in their games. "You know what?" the blonde woman said, stepping closer to Sarah. "I'm going to find another line. I don't want my children to have to see this when I bring them shopping. There should be some kind of warning or something." Sarah watched as the woman grabbed her cart and moved to another checkout line, her friend following close behind. Other customers avoided eye contact, some moving away as if Sarah's birthmark really was contagious. The young cashier looked at Sarah with sympathy in her eyes. "I'm really sorry about that," she whispered as she continued scanning Sarah's groceries. "Some people are just mean." Sarah managed a weak smile. "It's okay. I'm used to it." But it wasn't okay, and she wasn't really used to it. Each incident like this chipped away at her confidence, made her question whether she would ever be seen as more than just the woman with the mark on her face. She had worked so hard to build a life where her abilities mattered more than her appearance. But moments like these reminded her that many people would never see past her birthmark. As she paid for her groceries and walked toward the exit, Sarah could feel eyes following her. Some were curious, some sympathetic, and others filled with the same disgust she had encountered from the blonde woman. She held her head high, her military training kicking in, but inside she felt small and vulnerable. Little did Sarah know that her life was about to change forever. That tomorrow would bring an encounter that would shift everything she thought she knew about how the world saw her. The mark on her face that had been a source of shame and discrimination for 28 years was about to become something entirely different. The automatic doors of the grocery store slid open, and Sarah stepped into the evening air, unaware that this would be the last time she would face such cruelty without someone standing up for her. Tomorrow, everything would be different. The encounter that changed everything. The next morning, Sarah Martinez walked into the Naval Base cafeteria with the same routine she had followed for 6 years. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, and the birthmark on her left cheek was as prominent as always. She had learned to enter rooms with confidence, even when she knew people would stare. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual morning activity. Sailors grabbed quick breakfasts before their shifts, officers reviewed papers over coffee, and the kitchen staff worked efficiently behind the serving line. Sarah picked up a tray and joined the breakfast line, nodding politely to colleagues who acknowledged her. Behind her in line, she heard familiar whispers. 3 young sailors, probably new recruits, were talking in voices they thought were quiet enough. "Is that really a birthmark? Or did something happen to her?" one asked. "I heard she got burned in some kind of accident," another replied. "My cousin said she shouldn't be training people looking like that. It's distracting." "I don't know how she got promoted looking the way she does," the third added. "Must have been some kind of diversity thing." Sarah's shoulders tensed, but she continued moving through the line. She had heard variations of these conversations countless times. Some people genuinely didn't understand what a port wine stained birthmark was. Others created their own stories, and many questioned her qualifications based solely on her appearance. She selected her breakfast and moved toward the cashier, an older woman named Helen who had worked at the base for over 15 years. Helen always treated Sarah with kindness and respect, never once staring at her birthmark or making her feel uncomfortable. "Good morning, Petty Officer Martinez," Helen said warmly. "How are you doing today?" "Good morning, Helen." "I'm doing well, thank you," Sarah replied, grateful for the genuine smile that greeted her. As Sarah paid for her meal, she noticed a commotion near the entrance of the cafeteria. A group of high-ranking officers had entered, their dress uniforms indicating they were visiting dignitaries rather than regular base personnel. Among them was a man who commanded immediate attention and respect from everyone in the room. Commander James "Iron" Sullivan was a living legend in the Navy SEALs community. At 52, he had served for over 30 years, with countless classified missions under his belt. His presence was commanding, his reputation impeccable, and his standards impossibly high. When Commander Sullivan walked into a room, conversations stopped and people stood a little straighter. Sarah found a table in the corner, as she usually did, hoping to eat her breakfast in relative peace. She noticed that the three young sailors who had been talking about her had positioned themselves at a table nearby, still casting glances in her direction and continuing their whispered conversation. Commander Sullivan and his group were given a tour of the cafeteria by the base commanding officer. They moved through the space methodically, observing the facilities and occasionally stopping to speak with personnel. Sarah tried to focus on her breakfast, but she could feel the energy in the room shift as the distinguished visitors made their rounds. "Seriously, how did someone like that make it through basic training?" one of the young sailors said, his voice slightly louder now, emboldened by what he perceived as safety in numbers. "I bet the instructors went easy on her because they felt sorry for her." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She had heard these comments before, but they still stung. Every achievement in her military career had been questioned, every promotion scrutinized, every assignment viewed through the lens of her birthmark rather than her abilities. "My dad's a veteran, and he says the military has gotten too soft," another sailor continued. "They're more worried about being politically correct than having soldiers who actually look professional." The third sailor laughed quietly. "Can you imagine being in combat with someone like that? The enemy would be too busy staring to take her seriously." Sarah set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. She had spent 6 years proving herself over and over again, excelling in every evaluation, earning the respect of her superiors through sheer determination and skill. But conversations like this reminded her that to some people, she would never be anything more than an object of curiosity or pity. Commander Sullivan's group had moved closer to Sarah's section of the cafeteria. The base commanding officer was explaining something about meal schedules and nutrition programs when the commander's attention was drawn to the table of young sailors. "I'm just saying there should be some kind of standard," one of them was saying, his voice now clearly audible to nearby tables. "How can someone represent the Navy looking like that? What kind of message does it send?" Sarah felt her face burning with shame and anger. She wanted to stand up and confront them, to defend herself and her record of service. But her training had taught her to maintain composure even in difficult situations. She stared down at her untouched breakfast, willing herself to become invisible. Commander Sullivan had stopped walking. His steel-gray eyes had locked onto the table of young sailors, and his expression had shifted from casual observation to focused intensity. The base commanding officer, noticing the commander's sudden stillness, followed his gaze. "What are your thoughts on military appearance standards, Commander?" the young sailor continued, unaware that he had attracted the attention of one of the most decorated officers in the Navy. "Don't you think there should be some kind of requirement for people to look professional?" Sarah glanced up and saw Commander Sullivan's jaw tighten. The other officers in his group had also noticed the conversation and were watching with interest. The cafeteria had grown quieter, as if people sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Actually, I do have some thoughts on that," Commander Sullivan said, his voice cutting through the air with military precision. The young sailors looked up, suddenly realizing that their conversation had been overheard by the visiting officers. Their faces went pale as they recognized the rank and bearing of the man standing before them. "Stand up when a superior officer is addressing you," Commander Sullivan commanded. The three sailors scrambled to their feet, their breakfast forgotten, their faces now showing the fear that comes with being caught speaking carelessly in front of a legend. Sarah watched the scene unfold, unsure of what was happening or why the commander had intervened. She had never met him before, had no reason to expect that he would even notice her, let alone defend her. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about military appearance standards," Commander Sullivan continued, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "You seem to have some strong opinions about what it takes to serve in the United States Navy." The sailors exchanged nervous glances. Realizing they were in serious trouble, but not yet understanding the full scope of their mistake. "Would you care to share those opinions with me directly?" the commander asked, stepping closer to their table. The first sailor, the one who had been the most vocal, stammered. "Sir, we were discussing general standards, sir." "General standards," Commander Sullivan repeated slowly. "And you believe that a sailor's appearance should determine their fitness for service?" "Well, sir, we think that professionalism is important," another sailor managed to say. Sarah felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had no idea where this conversation was heading, but she could see that Commander Sullivan was building toward something significant. The entire cafeteria had now fallen silent, with everyone watching the unfolding confrontation. "Professionalism," Commander Sullivan said, nodding thoughtfully. "That's an interesting concept. Tell me, what do you know about the sailor you were discussing?" The young sailors looked confused, unsure of how to respond. They glanced briefly toward Sarah, then back at the commander. "Sir, we don't understand the question," one of them said. "The woman you were talking about," Commander Sullivan clarified. "What do you know about her service record, her qualifications, her contributions to the Navy?" The silence stretched for several long seconds as the sailors realized they had no answer. They had judged Sarah entirely based on her appearance, without any knowledge of who she was or what she had accomplished. Commander Sullivan's expression remained stern, but Sarah could see something else in his eyes, a determination that suggested this encounter was about to take an unexpected turn. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever, that this moment would become the turning point in how she saw herself and how others would see her. The salute that changed everything. Commander Sullivan's steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the three young sailors who stood frozen at attention. The entire cafeteria had fallen silent, with every person in the room sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Sarah Martinez sat at her corner table, her breakfast untouched, watching the scene with a mixture of anxiety and confusion. "Since you seem to know so little about the sailor you were discussing," Commander Sullivan said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military service, "allow me to educate you." He turned towards Sarah's table, and for the first time in the encounter, his expression softened slightly. "Petty Officer Martinez, would you please join us?" Sarah's heart began racing. Being singled out by one of the most decorated officers in the Navy was not something she had ever expected or prepared for. She stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady, and walked over to where the group was gathered. "Sir," she said quietly, standing at attention. Commander Sullivan studied her face for a moment, and Sarah braced herself for the familiar look of surprise or discomfort that usually crossed people's faces when they saw her birthmark up close. Instead, she saw something unexpected in his eyes, recognition and respect. "Petty Officer Martinez," he began, his voice now loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear, These young sailors were just expressing their concerns about military appearance standards. They seem to believe that how a person looks determines their fitness for service. I thought you might help me address their misconceptions. Sarah felt confused and terrified. She had no idea what the commander wanted from her or why he had chosen to involve her in this confrontation. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand," she managed to say. Commander Sullivan nodded. "Tell me about your service record, Petty Officer. Start with your training scores." Sarah glanced around the room, aware that dozens of people were hanging on every word. "Sir, I graduated top of my class in basic training. I scored in the 95th percentile on all physical fitness tests and received perfect marks in leadership evaluations." "Continue," Commander Sullivan instructed. "I completed advanced navigation training with honors, earned certifications in underwater rescue operations, and have been responsible for training over 200 new recruits in the past 3 years. I've received 4 commendations for excellence in service and was recommended for early promotion twice." The 3 young sailors were beginning to look uncomfortable as they realized the scope of their misjudgment. Around the cafeteria, other personnel were listening with growing interest and respect. "And your current assignment?" Commander Sullivan asked. "I'm head instructor for the Advanced Seamanship Program, sir. I'm responsible for training sailors in complex navigation, emergency procedures, and leadership skills for high-stakes maritime operations." Commander Sullivan turned back to the 3 young sailors, his expression stern. "So, to summarize, you were criticizing one of the finest sailors on this base, a woman who has consistently outperformed her peers and has dedicated her career to training people like you to be better sailors." The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Sarah could feel every eye in the room on her, but for the first time in her life, the attention didn't feel hostile or curious. People were looking at her with something she had rarely experienced, genuine respect. "But there's something else you should know about Petty Officer Martinez," Commander Sullivan continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "Something that makes this conversation particularly relevant to me." He paused, and Sarah felt her confusion deepen. She had no idea what he was referring to. 18 months ago, I was leading a classified rescue operation in hostile waters," Commander Sullivan began. "Our team had been sent to extract a group of captured intelligence officers from an enemy vessel. The operation was going according to plan until our navigation systems failed during a storm." The cafeteria remained silent, with everyone hanging on every word of the commander's story. "We were lost in dangerous waters, surrounded by enemy vessels, with injured personnel and failing equipment. Our mission was about to become a catastrophic failure. That's when we received an emergency transmission from this base." Sarah's eyes widened as she began to understand what the commander was describing. "The transmission came from the duty officer in the navigation center," Commander Sullivan continued. "Someone had been monitoring our mission frequency and had calculated our position based on fragmentary radio signals and weather data. This person provided us with precise coordinates that allowed us to navigate to safety and complete our rescue mission." Sarah remembered that night 18 months ago. She had been working the late shift in the navigation center when she picked up distressed radio signals from what she realized was a military operation in trouble. Using advanced triangulation techniques and weather modeling, she had spent hours calculating the most likely position of the vessel in distress. That duty officer's intervention saved the lives of 8 American service members, including myself, Commander Sullivan said. "The person who saved us worked for 6 hours straight, using advanced mathematical calculations and weather analysis to track our position. The mission commander's report specifically cited this individual's exceptional skill and dedication." The commander turned to face Sarah directly, and she saw recognition in his eyes. "That duty officer was Petty Officer Martinez," he announced to the silent cafeteria. Sarah felt her knees go weak. She had never known what had happened after she transmitted those coordinates. The operation had been classified, and she had never received any feedback about whether her calculations had been accurate or helpful. "Petty Officer Martinez," Commander Sullivan said, his voice now filled with emotion, "you saved my life and the lives of 7 other sailors. Your skill, your dedication, and your refusal to give up when others might have made the difference between life and death for American service members." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes as the weight of what she was hearing sank in. For 18 months, she had wondered if her late-night calculations had made any difference. Now she was learning that her work had been part of a life-saving rescue operation. Commander Sullivan turned back to the 3 young sailors, who now looked mortified at their earlier comments. "So when you question whether someone like Petty Officer Martinez belongs in the Navy," he said, his voice sharp with anger, "you're questioning the fitness for service of someone who has literally saved the lives of Navy SEALs. You're criticizing someone whose skills and dedication represent the very best of what our military stands for." The young sailors appeared to want to disappear entirely. Their faces were red with shame, and they couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Furthermore," Commander Sullivan continued, "your focus on Petty Officer Martinez's appearance reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a good sailor. The mark on her face is a birthmark, a completely natural variation in human appearance that has no bearing whatsoever on her abilities, her character, or her value as a person and a service member." Sarah had never heard anyone defend her birthmark so directly and forcefully. Throughout her life, people had either ignored it, stared at it, or made cruel comments about it. No one had ever described it as simply a natural variation that didn't affect her value as a person. Commander Sullivan stepped closer to Sarah, and his expression became serious and formal. "Petty Officer Martinez," he said, "it is my honor to finally meet the sailor who saved my team. I've been hoping for an opportunity to thank you personally for your exceptional service." What happened next would become the moment that Sarah Martinez remembered for the rest of her life, the moment that changed everything she thought about herself and her place in the world. Commander James "Iron" Sullivan, one of the most decorated officers in the United States Navy, a legend among Navy SEALs, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, stepped back and rendered a perfect military salute to Sarah. The salute was crisp, respectful, and held for several long seconds. It was the salute of one professional acknowledging another, of one warrior honoring another, of one human being showing profound respect for another. The entire cafeteria erupted in spontaneous applause. Sailors, officers, and civilian staff members all began clapping, some wiping away tears, others standing to show their respect. The 3 young sailors who had been making cruel comments looked ashamed and began clapping along with everyone else. Sarah returned the salute, her hand trembling with emotion. Tears streaming down both cheeks, the one with the birthmark and the one without. For the first time in her 28 years, she felt truly seen and valued for who she really was. As the applause continued, Sarah realized that everything had changed. The mark on her face hadn't disappeared, but its meaning had been transformed. It was no longer a source of shame or difference. It was simply part of who she was, a decorated sailor, a lifesaver, and a person worthy of respect and honor. Commander Sullivan approached her as the applause began to die down. "Petty Officer Martinez," he said quietly, "I want you to know that your service record has been reviewed at the highest levels. You're being recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal for your actions 18 months ago. You saved lives, and the Navy wants to recognize your exceptional service." Sarah could barely speak through her tears. "Thank you, sir. It was just doing my job." "No," Commander Sullivan replied firmly. "It was excellence in service. It was exactly the kind of dedication and skill that makes me proud to serve alongside sailors like you." As the crowd began to disperse and normal activity resumed in the cafeteria, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues who wanted to congratulate her and express their respect. The three young sailors who had started the entire incident approached hesitantly. "Petty Officer Martinez," the first one said, his voice shaking with nervousness and shame. "We want to apologize. We were completely wrong, and we're sorry for our disrespectful comments." Sarah looked at the young men, seeing genuine remorse in their eyes. "Apology accepted," she said. "But I hope you'll remember this lesson. Don't judge people based on their appearance. You never know what someone has accomplished or what they're capable of." As Sarah finally sat down to eat her breakfast, now cold but somehow more satisfying than any meal she had ever eaten, she reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of 30 minutes. The mark on her face was still there, as prominent as ever, but she would never see it the same way again. From that day forward, whenever Sarah walked into a room and saw people staring at her birthmark, she would remember the moment when Commander Sullivan saluted her. She would remember that she was a decorated sailor who had saved lives, a professional who had earned her place through skill and dedication, and a person whose worth was measured by her character and accomplishments, not by her appearance. The mark on her face had not changed, but everything else had. She was no longer the woman with the birthmark who happened to be a sailor. She was Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, lifesaver, decorated service member, and a person worthy of respect and salute from the finest officers in the United States Navy.